Hey everyone, today we are going to talk about devices and techniques, and I'm specifically going to frame this within how can we strategize our close reading and annotating of a passage for an essay while also incorporating in devices so that we can be really efficient with our time and really strategic with our planning. We're going to focus on that process of reading and annotating in this video. So first, when we're thinking strategies, there are these kind of first 5 steps that I always will encourage you to take when you're given either a passage or a poem. The steps kind of work the same whenever you're given some text to look at and then respond to provided the prompt. So our first step is going to be to deconstruct that prompt so you know what to focus on in your reading. So if we look at, this is for the FRQ2, the prose-based passage, because that's what I'm going to be using examples for today. This is the College Board's stable wording. So notice it says the following excerpt is from blah. In this passage, blah, blah, blah. Read the passage carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how the author uses literary elements and techniques to blah, 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 blah. So notice that these highlighted parts, the blahs, that's where information is going to be inserted, but the rest of the question that's not highlighted is going to stay exactly like that. So we have in yellow the author, date, title information. We have a little bit of context in teal, and then we have the task, the question that we have to answer, the thing we're going to focus on in green. So let's look at an example of this. The following excerpt is from Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1852 novel, The Blithedale Romance. In this passage, 2 characters who have been living on the Blithedale farm, a community designed to promote an ideal of equality achieved through communal rural living, are about to part ways. Read the passage carefully. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze how Hawthorne uses literary elements and techniques to portray the narrator's complex attitude towards Zenobia. So let's go through and color code and talk through how these 3 parts of the prompt are going to help us. First, if we look at the author, date of publication, and text, we're told that we've got Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1852. It's a novel, not a short story or a drama, not a tragedy, The Blithedale Romance. So with that information, this should inform you of some things that you might want to consider for a moment. So does the title provide you with any insight into the work? So when I look at it, I'm thinking Blithedale might be a place, right? The Blithedale Romance. There might be a love story involved. It could also be like romanticism, right? So I'm not committed to that. For me, the title doesn't tell me much in this one. It's not a work that I'm familiar with. When I get down to the next 2, though, I do have a little bit of background information. Who's the author? Nathaniel Hawthorne. Well, I know a little bit about him. He's the guy that wrote A Scarlet Letter. He wrote a bunch of short stories, Young Goodman Brown, The Birthmark, Rappaccini's Daughter. He was writing often about New England. He also was really focused on like historical fiction, like The Scarlet Letter, and there was a lot on morality and religion. He was kind of anti-puritanical. So when I'm going into reading this, I'm kind of looking for those ideas of morality and religion potentially, because I know this is Nathaniel Hawthorne going in. I know he's a writer who writes a lot about New England and things like that, the Puritans, though not necessarily directly the Puritans. And then what's happening in the author's environment when it was written? Well, even if I don't know anything about Nathaniel Hawthorne, I have that it's 1852. So that tells me that I'm smack in the Romantic period, which certainly starts sending off some good flags for me about like nature being super important and a place of innocence. Now, I do also have the background knowledge that Nathaniel Hawthorne was into dark romanticism. It ties really well with his ideas about morality and religion. So I'm kind of expecting this passage could be something where it's kind of that cautionary tale of like all of humanity is like bad, or guilt or sin or evil. That's all inherent in us. And the natural world is good. So it might go that route. That's just something I've got in my pocket. Knowing that it's Romantic period, though, I'm going to keep a special eye out for setting and nature in particular because of that indicator. Okay, so after I've just done a quick consideration of what information the title, date, and author give me, then I'm going to look at my next piece, which is going to give me context. The commenting on what the passage is about says 2 characters who have been living on the Blithedale farm. So now I know I've got a location. Blithedale farm is my location. I've got 2 people there. A community designed to promote an ideal of equality achieved through communal rural living. So just looking at that piece there, Blithedale farm, it's a commune. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It's rural. People probably each have different jobs. It's not like they live in their own houses and don't talk to one another. They work together on a regular basis, and they're supposed to be feeling very equal to one another because of that. I don't know if it's going to work out that way or not, but that's the idea that they're trying to achieve. And then it says they are about to part ways. So that says to me that this could go one of 2 ways, right? Either the characters like one another and it's going to be really sad, or maybe they hate one another and they're going to be really kind of good riddance with one another. So when I'm looking at this teal section, I'm asking myself, what does it help me understand about the plot? What do I know now in terms of setting, in terms of their community? And then what do you know about the characters' perspectives and or their relationships already? I know that these 2 characters that are about to part ways have lived really closely together with one another in probably a kind of hard life if it's a rural setting and they're having to do all of these things to survive on this farm. They probably have a lot of resources available to them, but it's still going to be labor and hard work. I'm also kind of expecting maybe a conflict of some kind because they are about to part ways. Most things for AP Lit don't tend to be warm and fuzzy and mushy-gushy. So I'm kind of expecting it to go to the negative side, but we'll see. And then the last thing we're going to look at is this green part where we're looking at getting information about a thematic, topical, or structural aspect of the passage that we're supposed to focus on. This is our task when we're looking at portraying the narrator's complex attitude towards Zenobia. This task is what's going to focus us. So we have some background information, hopefully, from the author, title, and publication date, and from the information about what else is going on in this novel. And now we're going to focus in on what we should be interpreting. Because the green section asks me to identify and explain the narrator's complex attitude towards Zenobia, I'm going to guess that Zenobia is probably one of the characters and the narrator is the other. So those are my 2 characters that are about to part ways. The narrator, maybe it's going to be first person, maybe it's going to be third person limited, but our narrator has conflicting feelings or complicated feelings about Zenobia. So I'm going to be answering the question in my thesis, what are those complex feelings? Like I'm going to have to identify them and then explain what function they're serving or what interpretation should I be taking away. Now, if you're going after that thematic, broader context here, then I may be thinking about how is this commentary on communal living? How is it commentary on rural living? Maybe it's commentary on relationships between people who are supposed to be equal, relationships between partners, people who depend on one another. I'm looking at kind of that like relationship side of things, I think, and maybe something with being communal or rural. But I'm kind of putting together the teal and the green in particular to form some guesses about like what do I need to be looking for in highlighting and annotating when I see it in the text, because it's related to some of those ideas. Okay, so that was deconstructing the prompt. You should spend a couple of minutes doing that before you even read the passage. After you've done that deconstruction and focused yourself, then you should read the passage. The first time you read it, I would recommend just reading for basic comprehension. Think about it not in terms of annotating and highlighting and zooming in on that focus, but just like what is happening in this passage. Just basic reading comprehension is all you're going after. Maybe almost like reading for pleasure, kind of like trying to get into the story so that you get a sense for what's happening. When you finish that first reading, you're going to go through and read it again. This time, though, thinking about where you could split it into pieces. So is there like a beginning section, a middle section, and an end? Does it split into just a big first half, second half? Where are some logical places that it divides? The reason we're doing that is that's going to help us with essay organization later. So we're just trying to chunk it. After you've decided where those logical chunks are, that's when we're actually going to start writing and annotating. Well, I guess when we chunk it, I tend to draw a line on my paper, and you'll be able to do that on the exam as well. So, draw your lines to chunk this section and that section and the last section, however many sections there are. And then we're going to go back to each of those sections and annotate for the big five and also any shifts. So we've talked about the big five a lot this year, just without calling it the big five. I'm talking about those 5 broad categories of devices and techniques that authors use to create stories. So we're looking at characterization, narration, plot and structure, setting, and figurative language. All of the terms that are underneath those are ones that you could be annotating for potentially, though I'm really focused on kind of these big ideas, and some of the little ideas might pop up. Now, I do want to say I've given you some sample things that you might look for here that tend to be the most common. Notice these aren't super specific. Like with figurative language, I have contrast here. Contrast could be anything from the word choice that the author is using, right? Going from positive to negative or bright to dark, diction, and imagery. It could also be things like similes, right? Because they compare and contrast two things that you wouldn't normally put together. Personification, metaphors, all that can be kind of lumped together within some of these mid-range categories if we have big ideas, medium ideas, and then those really narrow devices that we focus a lot on, especially in the lower grades. Okay, so with that, I do also want to point out that when I'm doing this annotating, there are 3 questions I'm going to ask myself over and over and over again. When I find something that I think is relevant to that prompt from a little bit ago, I'm going to ask myself what is happening specifically here. Maybe it's related to characterizations, like what's happening in their relationship. Is Zenobia being a jerk to the narrator? And then if that's happening, then how do we know? What is Zenobia specifically doing or saying? What are her actions, her dialogue, whatever? How do I know that Zenobia is being a jerk? And then why is that important? How does that inform the narrator's attitude towards Zenobia? What does that make the narrator feel? So I can do that with each one of these big 5 ideas. I can look at the setting and say, what's happening in the setting? Is there a storm? How do I know? Looking for that imagery, because you can describe storms different ways, right? Is the rain like thunder, lightning coming down? Is the rain like a spring shower? Those are very different atmospheres that setting is created depending on the textual evidence that we have. That how do we know? Then we can link it to why is it important? Functionally, what's going on there? Those 3 key questions to consider will help you to focus your annotations so you don't feel like you're just scavenger hunting for literary devices that you don't know if you're going to use or not. I will say I also have put this bit.ly here. It goes to the PDF that has this big 5 graphic, but if you keep scrolling down, I did several pages for each of the big 5 that goes into some specific questions you can think about asking yourself within each of these. So if you want to be a little bit more specific and maybe have a post-it note of questions beside you that you start using over the next month or so in preparation for the exam, something more specific than these 3, that resource is there for you so you can really see what kinds of questions you could be asking yourself to help you make the annotation and literary device identification part easier for you. Okay, so after you've done that, then it's time to determine your thematic concepts, your theme statements, that kind of thing. And that starts to move us into the writing side of things, away from the annotating and close reading. So we're going to pause here today, and I want you to try some practice with this that we're going to use next class when I see you. I'd like for you to read the prompt and passage that's on Schoology that I've pulled from the novel A Man Called Ove. I've given you the prompt and also the passage in PDF and Jamboard form. I want you to go through all 5 of these steps. So do your deconstruction, do your close reading of the text and see if using those two things, the prompt you've deconstructed and the passage that you have an understanding of, can you come up with thematic concepts and ideally a theme statement. Once you've done that, we'll regroup in class and talk about next steps and also reflect on kind of how this went and what we could do to improve this strategy for you.